Okay, so finally, let's talk about the potential for violent media to produce desensitization. Here, the theory is that we have kind of basic psychological and physiological habituation. The idea behind habituation is that through repeated exposure to the same stimulus, we may have a decrease in the physiological arousal or response to that particular stimulus. So, if there is a loud siren that goes off, this unexpected, you may have a startled response, you may kind of jump. But if that siren continues to sound over and over and over again, then it's likely that that startle response will decrease. We'll see a decrease in your physical, your psychological, your emotional response to that repeated stimulus. So the idea here is that through a steady diet of violent media, we are repeatedly exposed to violent images over and over and over again. And while initially we may have a strong physiological and emotional response, we may have emotional distress in response to these images, that over time, through repeated exposure, this distress, this emotional response will essentially be blunted. Right? We're not going to have the same emotional distress and physiological arousal after repeated exposures. And so to examine this, we'll look at the study of Bartholomew and colleagues in 2006. In this particular study, we have male participants who have reported that they are steady video game players in their personal life. So all of these males report that they repeatedly play video games, and what we're comparing are video gamers who report that they play violent games versus video game players who report that they play non-violent games, because it's not playing video games that we're really interested in. It's specifically the exposure to the violent content that is of interest here. So the first thing that they are asked to do is to connect to an EEG machine. So if you've never been exposed to EEG before, typically what we have is a cap in which we have electrodes that are placed on the scalp in various areas to measure particularly the timing across regions of brain activity. And so an EEG is typically not as precise, especially in terms of the area or the region in which we're measuring. It's not as precise as like fMRI, but it is typically more kind of cost effective. It's less expensive and less invasive than fMRI. In this particular study, the researchers are interested in event-related potentials, which is a change in voltage or brain activity that's measured in the EEG output. That reflects engagement of various information processing activities in the brain. And so specifically, our researchers are interested in this P300 amplitude, and they're looking for a deflection in the P300 amplitude. The reason that this is of interest is because this has been observed in past research to be an indicator of conflict detection. So when we detect conflict in our environment, we should have a very strong deflection in this P300 amplitude output for the EEG response. And by conflict, we're referring to a detection that something is out of the ordinary. So I am detecting that something doesn't fit with everything that I have processed prior to this stimulus. So I'm detecting that this stimulus doesn't fit with everything else that I've seen. This is out of the norm, right? So we're looking for that conflict detection when they're shown a series of images. And so these are just images that I found, not necessarily the specific ones that they used, but they did show our participants kind of normal average images. So most of the images that they see are things like a guy wearing a backpack, two guys talking around a water cooler, but interspersed in this large series of kind of normal everyday images are violent images. So something like this, a man holding a gun to someone's head. So we have violent images, and we have negative images that are not necessarily violent in nature. So decomposing bodies, maggots, that sort of thing. So things that are kind of more disgusting rather than violent. And so the idea is that if you see a guy wearing a backpack, two guys talking, and then all of a sudden you see this, you should have that large deflection and amplitude of that P300, that response that indicates that you detect that this image is very different from this image, right? That this is not normal. This doesn't fit. And in fact, it's very abnormal, right? And the same thing for a decomposing body, right? That this is not normal. Right? This doesn't fit with the other series of images. So you're detecting that this is a conflict. What the researchers found was that those males who reported specifically that they played violent video games showed a blunted deflection in that P300 response specifically to violent images. So again, suggesting that they are, to not the same degree, detecting that the violent images are not normative. So the desensitization, the habituation theory is that with repeated exposure to violent images, this becomes normalized. This becomes the norm. It's not something out of the ordinary. It's not a conflict with our everyday lives because it's a part of our everyday lives. And cognitively, maybe physiologically and emotionally, we're not responding strongly to these images after repeated exposure. And it's something specific to the violent images because the researchers did not see that blunted response to the negative images that were not violent in nature. So they still responded that, ooh, this is a conflict, this is not normal, when it was a decomposing body or maggots or something gross or disgusting. So they realized that, you know, some negative things were non-normative, were conflict out of the ordinary, but they had become desensitized to specifically the violent images. And what's more is that when they, after this test, had them engage in a competitive game, they found that those specifically who reported that they played violent video games, who had this blunted, kind of desensitized response, behaved significantly more aggressively in that competitive game. Right, in much the same way that we've measured aggression previously with the blast of noise. So we see this connection between violent video game play, violent media consumption, and desensitization, and then subsequent aggressive responding.